introduce Dr. LeeAnn Caldwell. She is the director at the Center for the Studies of Georgia History at Augusta University, and one of my previous teachers. So I'm so excited to introduce Dr. LeeAnn Caldwell. Give her a hand.
Thanks, Crystal. You know, when you teach as long as I did, I'm not teaching now, I'm just doing research and writing, but when you teach as long as I did, you run into your former students all over the place, all over town. So, and it's great to see them and to see how well they've done. Makes you feel like you did something worthwhile. So, thank you for coming out on a cold day. When I woke up this morning and it was 16, I thought, oh, I bet I'm going to be there with Nancy. I myself, I took our dog out and he put his little paws on the grass and ran back to the door. Didn't even go to the bathroom, ran to the door. And I said, So I'm gonna tell you a little bit about how we chose this topic. And as I go along, I'm going to tell you about some of the speakers we've got coming up who are going to go into a little bit more depth than I can. And at the very end, we're going to play around with a couple of primary sources. That great Southern writer exploring the enigma that is the American South, William Faulkner, wrote, "The past is never dead, it isn't even past." And I believe that in many ways. The echoes of events and people of earlier times are all around us, and of course we too are passing through. History gives us a sense of our place in the continuity of the human experience. It makes us more mindful of our present and more conscious of our responsibility to the future and people not even born. I had several living grandparents and great-grandparents. My great-grandparents, 3 of them, lived into my 40s. Wow. So I literally grew up with walking history. My my 2 grandmothers lived even longer. One of my grandmothers died at 96 and the other one at 89. So I heard history. People born in the late 19th and early 20th century who literally started with horse and buggy. And then my grandmother was flying down to Florida to see my cousins in her later life. So what a span of history. My parents were children of the Depression and World War II. And so these ideas and events and people from the past shaped me. And I was a true baby boomer, not just in the sense of being born in the baby boom years, but also being the oldest of 6 children, 4 of them brothers. So in a lot of ways, when I finally took and started studying some women's history, I found out that my own experience fit right into what we were finding about how women were raised and what they were taught. For example, my parents were interested not only in my academic work, which I always loved, but to make sure I got the things that girls were supposed to have. So I had ballet, I had piano, I had ballroom dancing, all those ornamentals that a nice young girl was supposed to be able to do. Now, I will say that those things have brought me great pleasure in my adult life. When I was a senior in high school, I had already finished a lot of the requirements, so they insisted that I take typing because any young woman might need a secretarial job at some time, and you needed to have that to fall back on. I cannot tell you how much money that saved me in graduate school, college and graduate school. And of course now, I can't text very well because my fingers want to do this. They know where the keys are. So I benefited from those patterns But there were other patterns that were being changed. My grandmothers were both college educated, which in the early 1900s was quite unusual, actually, in the South. Both of them taught in school, and one of them taught school for basically her whole life. The other one did for years until her children were born. So this is the history that's part of me, and history is the story of all of us. Story of human beings. So there's greed and heroism, there's pettiness and sacrifice, corruption, nobility. Turn on the news, see it all. History can be cautionary, but it can inspire as well. Answers to the good and bad of the present can only be understood through a realistic understanding of the past, the interactions of people, the events they participated in, the natural environments they molded, the forces that shaped their ideas and then were passed down to us, each generation planting seeds to root for the next. History is all around us. You came through it today, trying to get here. Landscapes, place names, writings, monuments, buildings, art, literature, the results of the past and the decisions that were made in it, all part of our lives today. Now, I do a fair amount of speaking here at the museum. Nancy always gets me to kick off whatever we're going to do in the first of the year, and I also speak to the white glove dinners. And so she's heard me make these points about history and its importance many times, and it's really, I think, out of that we talked about what we're doing this year. Nancy had this idea. How do we introduce people to these aspects of history that you see all around us? And so that's where evidence of impact came from. We got together in this, I guess, late spring, early summer, and talked about what we could address in a year's time that would help us not only learn about the past, but learn about its impact on us today. Now, for we historians, that begins with primary sources. And most of you may know this, but when I taught methods, which I did for 30-something years, I found my students, when I talk about primary sources, I realized that some of them thought I meant the main one you use, the primary one you use. So we had to explain, no, primary sources are sources that were created at the time you're studying by the people who were involved in that. So we use primary sources. The secondary sources come from studying the primary sources, and secondary sources, books about things and dissertations about things, all of those are important. They're important for getting things in perspective, getting things in the context of their time. And I'm going to show you a couple of things that will, at the end, that will do that. So what we're exploring this year are what some of those sources are, how to preserve some of those sources. I know that next month, Courtney Berg, who's the Special Collections Librarian at the university, is going to talk a little bit about how to preserve primary sources that you yourself may have. And so my task today is I'm going to give you an overview. So what are some primary sources? Well, let's start with manuscripts. So manuscripts can include things like letters. This show and tell. These are a tiny portion of the hundreds of letters I found in my parents' basement after my mother died, when we were cleaning out. We didn't even know they were down there. I don't know if they remembered they were down there. These are letters that my father, these particular ones, I have the other side of this too, because my father saved his from her. But these are letters to Miss Peggy Sheeran, Maxwell Hall in New York. She was in New York. They had met at Emory, and this was after World War II. This is 1948. She was doing an intern, what what we call an internship in nursing school at Columbia Presbyterian. And they had to deal with him. So she's living in New York. He's still in Georgia. And they wrote each other almost every day. And they're really not only sweet, but they're a picture into these post-World War II young couples who started the baby boom. And hers are an interesting look at nursing at the time. And there were all kinds of things that came to mind how these could be used by historians. So, if you have letters in your attic, Tom Robertson can talk about this because he's used letters to write books with. If you have letters in your attic, look at them before you throw them out, or make some disposition of them before you leave this earthly life, because I can tell you for a fact, I know when it's happened, that kids come in and they're cleaning out, which is hard, and they just toss things. So see if you have something that is that would be worth preserving. So letters, diaries. We found a diary that my mother had when she was 13, and it proved that she was as boy crazy at 13 as girls were my generation at 13. And there are, of course, other kind of family papers. Business records, that may not sound interesting, but account book, we use account books from the colonial period to see how business was conducted and what kinds of things people were buying and selling. Advertisements, I have used city directories to look at advertisements from various time periods, and they're fascinating. Not only does it tell you who was selling what, but kind of what the products were that people wanted. Church records. Church records often have baptismal records. They have confirmations and other things. I think when Catherine comes to talk about genealogy, she will talk about how you can track down some ancestors in these ways. Organizational records. Ed Cashin wrote a history of the Augusta Exchange Club using their minutes and other organizational records. So if you're involved in a nonprofit, I use the Philomathic Club's records, what they saved that are in special collections, when I wrote an article for Augusta Magazine about the Philomathic Club. In nonprofits, you want to write a history of the Historic Augusta, for example, Augusta Museum of History. There are records of what you go to. I'll tell you, historians are really worried because records are in cyberspace now. What's going to happen if we lose our ability to access those? I mean, even now, if historians trying to do something with a 5-inch floppy disk, it's hard. You have to find, sometimes it's a museum, it's the only place that's preserved those early machines that can do that kind of stuff. Speeches, we saw a lot of that this weekend with Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches and how significant they were. Government documents, so there are documents from the colonial period, from the colonial governments. Local documents include things like city directories. I had a request from the Arts Council. There was a person who wanted to redo an advertising mural that was on a building up in Harrisburg, but they didn't know, it didn't say what the store was or anything, it just said what they were selling. And I was able to figure it out by going city directory to city directory until I found who was in the building selling what was advertised on the wall. So that's a really good place to go sometimes. I use city directories a lot. Property deeds, tax records, birth, marriage, and death certificates, public cemetery records. I had a student back in the 1980s. She was African American and she wanted to study Cedar Grove Cemetery. But what she ended up doing was using the records of Cedar Grove, which listed cause of death, and she used it to do this incredible study on mortality in the Black community in a 20-year period in the early 20th century, what people were dying of, what ages they were dying of, how men and women compared to each other, how that changed as we get a little later in history. It was a really incredible study. So cemetery records can be great. City County Commission minutes. I'm finished writing, and I hope it will be out this year if they get the pictures together, an updated history of the Augusta Canal. And I read thousands of pages of Canal Authority minutes in the process of doing that. And then I had to call Tom Robertson to explain the engineering parts of it to me. There are Board of Education minutes. That's how we found out Lucy Laney wasn't in Savannah. She was here when they thought she was in Savannah. And I found that out because I wasn't even looking for her. I was looking for something else. And there's Lucy Laney on the paid list for public schools here in Augusta. So she was here in public schools before she founded her own school. So all those kind of records can be fascinating. Court records. You should read some of the court cases from various time periods. There are state records like legislative minutes, official correspondence from people like the governors and other executives. The state has a Board of Education. Most of the state records are in the Georgia Department of Archives and History, which is in Morrow, Georgia. There are federal records, the National Archives and Records Administration, NARA, which you have heard a lot in the news because things are supposed to go to NARA from the federal government. Library of Congress has a wonderful photo collection that's open source now. So you can go in and you want to do a PowerPoint, you can get pictures from there and use them publicly. There are collections in presidential libraries and other kinds of libraries. I worked when I was in grad school in the Richard Russell Library at the University of Georgia, and now they have lots of Senate and congressional the records of senators and congressmen there. And of course, census material. If you're doing any kind of genealogy, the census is such a great place to go. And it's not just, can I find somebody here? It's who were they living with? Who was living next door? Who was living in the neighborhood? I was looking at some of the census records for Augusta in the late 1800s. Segregation had not set in here because if you look at the records, blacks and whites are living next door to each other, down the street from each other. They were together, which is an interesting little window on that time period. Our first ordinance of segregation was not passed until 1913. It's almost 40 years after the Civil War. So it's not like segregation sets in immediately. And we find these things out. All right, oral history. Oral history is so much fun to do. And you're going to have two people talk about oral history this year. Corey Rogers from the Laney Museum. They did some incredible, including Tuskegee Airmen, but a lot of other people in the black community, as well as some Chinese Americans who also lived in the black community. And he'll talk about that. Mark Alberton, of course, who is our incredible local documentarian, uses oral history for all kinds of projects. He and I did that Finding Home video using oral history. Mark was also part of the 800 oral histories we have at AU now through the Historical Society of World War II Veterans. It's one of the largest collections in the country. A very, very important thing we did. And they're now working on Vietnam and Korea as well. Oral histories, and there are actually entire books based on oral histories. Midwife's Tale, I don't know if any of you have ever read it. That's the wrong book. Women's histories and diaries of the westward movement. I used an oral history collection in my women's history class from Rosie the Riveters in World War II. So there are whole things based on oral history. The Midwife's Tale, which I meant to hold up earlier, is based on a diary, a woman's diary in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Now, this is a part of it is literally the diary, but also part of it is the historian explaining what the diary says by identifying people in it and maps and how things related to each other. So those can be very important. Another primary source that I brought to show you is the American Frugal Housewife, which was printed in 1833, and it tells women how to do things in their house, how to take care of their houses and children. Architecture, the built environment. What did our ancestors build? I mean, we can look back thousands of years sometimes to see what our ancestors were building. What does it tell us about them, about their culture, their environment, their taste, what they did? From log cabins in forested areas to sod houses on the plains, Greek Revival mansions to Victorian asymmetry, craftsmen in the 1920s in bungalows. What about glass towers versus neoclassical skyscrapers of the Chicago style? The Lamar building is Chicago. You look up at the cornice, it has that wonderful, wonderful architecture. Not the very top, not the iron painting, the other part. As opposed to, say, the bank. Well, what was the bank? It's now AU. Was built as Georgia Railroad Bank. So one of the most fabulous architectural historians, Ellen Pruitt, will be here to tell us about how architecture reflects history. Art and literature, portraits, and later photographs tell a lot more than what somebody looked like. So you want to see what Grandpa looked like, well, here's a picture. But what were they wearing? How did they dress themselves? How did they groom themselves? Why did they look the way they looked? How did they frame themselves? What image were they trying to project in those pictures? How did it reflect the time period they were in? Like artists, writers are not in a vacuum. They reflect the influences around them, the times and events. The first paper I ever wrote when I came back from college and I decided to go to what was NAC, because I was teaching school and I had been out of state to college. I never had a Georgia history course, so I took Ed Cashin's, which was the best thing I ever did for myself. We had to write a paper, and I wrote a paper. We had to use only primary sources, and I wrote about the literature, the history of literature in Georgia and how that reflected the history in general, of what was going on. Sometimes it's really obvious what the influences were, the times, the events, the ethos. Think of something like Grapes of Wrath. I used to use Tobacco Road in some of my classes because Erskine Caldwell wrote Tobacco Road after he came home for Christmas in 1932, and he actually based it on some things he had seen while he was here. And even though it's a fictionalized account, it gives a sense of what people were dealing with and how that affected them. As Caldwell's minister father said, people can be so poor they can't be moral. And they can't be decent. He said they can't be decent. And so it really gives a sense into that time. The man in the gray flannel suit in the 50s, when Americans were trying to come to grips with this corporatization, basically, of the workplace and of America. Sometimes maybe less so. I mean, why did spy novels become so popular? They became popular in the Cold War. So there's something going on around these writers. Why are rom-coms so popular now? You know, people want to think that it works that way. They want to think you can really find love across a crowded room, you know, kind of thing. And it gives people a sense of hope. Poetry as well. Poetry is literature. Whitman, To the Wasteland. I'm going to read just a little bit of a poem that was written in the 1600s by Anne Bradstreet. And she wrote it because she had realized that she was pregnant. And you get the sense of how that was ambiguous for a lot of women, not being pregnant, but what they thought about being pregnant was. All things within this fading world have end. Adversity does still our joys attend. No ties so strong, no friends so dear and sweet, but with death's parting blow is sure to meet. The sentence past is most irrevocable, a common thing, yet so inevitable. How soon, my dear, death may my steps attend. How soon may it be thy lot to lose thy friend. We both are ignorant, yet love bids me these farewell lines to recommend to thee. That when that knot's untied that made us one, I may seem thine, who in effect am none. And if I see not half my days its due, what nature would God grant to yours and you? The many faults that well you know I have, let be interred in my oblivion's grave. If any worth of virtue were in me, let that live freshly in thy memory. And when thou feelst no grief, as I no harms, yet love thy dead who long lay in thine arms. And when thy loss shall be repaid with gains, look to my little babes, my dear remains. And if thou love thyself or lovest me, these, O protect from step-dames, dame's injury. And if chance to thine eyes shall bring this verse with some sad sighs, honor my absent hearse, and kiss this paper for thy love's dear sake, who with salt tears this last farewell did make. She's writing that to her husband in case she does not survive this present pregnancy, which was not that uncommon in that time period. And of course, memoir and autobiography are part of this as well. Jim Garvey, and I think most of you probably know, he was a professor of English, he will come do that. Newspapers, you have to be somewhat careful with newspapers. Are you looking at the news part? Are you looking at the opinion page part? But they can be used for all kinds of things. I saw a wonderful study that was done by a historian using nothing but runaway slave advertisements in antebellum newspapers. It's got all kinds of demographics out of that. Social columns. If you're doing any research on Black history in Augusta, you can't do it without reading Notes Among the Colored, which was published every week. It tells you all the clubs, it tells you who's going north, it's an amazing source for the early 20th century. They have political cartoons, which tell you something about the environment. And some newspapers are really written for advocacy. This is a copy of The Revolution, which was written by the women's movement when they were hoping, this is started in 1868, this is when they're hoping to get the vote in the 15th. They want to be included in the 15th Amendment, and so that was the goal of it. Bill Kirby's going to come. You've all read Bill Kirby. Bill writes some amazing pieces on history using the Augusta Chronicle. And finally, Elena Rich is going to talk about artifacts. What kind of tools, equipment, furnishing, technology did our ancestors have, and what's implied by those pieces? Who built them? Who had new ideas, and how did those new ideas change how people lived? Have y'all seen these things? They're hilarious on the internet where you get somebody my grandchildren's age and put a rotary phone in front of them. They have no idea first what it is, and when you tell them, they can't figure it out. They keep poking their fingers through the holes, trying to figure out how to use these things. And I remember when my grandmother had a party line, so you had to listen for your ring. So my point is we're walking through history, touching history, reading history every day, even if we don't realize we are. Why are streets or buildings or businesses or schools named what they're named? What do they tell about what or who people admired at the time? Why was Union Station named Union Station? Not because people around here were pro-Union in the Civil War, for sure. It was named that because it was the station for all the railroads that came into Augusta. The Central, the Southern, and I forgot there was one other one. And they had worked it out where they could all use the same station. So, how much time do I have? Like,
keep going.
5 minutes? Okay. This was going to be the end, and then last night I got to thinking it'd be fun just to look at a couple of primary sources. And so I apologize, this is not a very polished presentation because I didn't have a working scanner, so I actually took these pictures with my phone. And, but it can give you an idea of some of these things and how you can use them. There's Augusta, 1872. Nancy told me that they have the original of this. It's amazing. It's a bird's eye view. And if you look at it, you can come up and look up close at it. You will see, and the orientation here is, this is actually north, and this goes toward the south, so it looks upside down. But you can see the buildings and what they looked like. You can see St. Paul's Church sitting right there after the railroad bridge. And so it's a good way. We check this to sometimes see if something was built yet and what was here in this time.
What year is this?
1872. All right. There we go. This is a map of the Walker Estate, which is where AU is today. Ed Cashin had always said that Bellevue Hall was not the Freeman Walker House. He said he knew he'd been into the convent where the floors were the original Freeman Walker House, he knew. But when we found this map, and A on this map is what they were calling the Walker House, and you can see that this is not the footprint of Bellevue Hall at all. So we were able to finally begin to figure out what this was, and it's not Bellevue Hall. This is what's called an inventory of estate. And I used to use this in my class and let my students work in teams to figure out what all you can learn from this. Now I only put one page of it up here. But what is the first thing Mr. W. Anderson lists in his estate? Or his executor's list? Slaves. And he lists them by name, which is sometimes one of the few ways African Americans can verify family, and value on the side there. So there are two columns of them, which means that he was a wealthy planter. And if we don't have I don't have the rest of it here, but you can see that his livestock was worth $1,900. His slaves are worth $26,000.
Wow.
So the bulk of his estate is tied up in human property. Now, you know, it's interesting. You can do some things with naming and how they named people. You can also do some things with men and women and who was valuable and who wasn't valuable. And some of the people that were more valuable turned out to be artisans who had a craft. Notice at the bottom it says Venus, who was one of the elderly slaves, Venus minus $150. Venus, in other words, was so elderly that she was not productive, and so they actually took off some from the estate for whoever got Venus. Now, the next thing he lists is his livestock, and does anything jump out at you about this?
I can't read it.
He lists them the same way, by name. He lists them by name and by age and value, just like he does the slaves. Now there's more pages of this that have his furniture and everything else, but you get an idea that you can use this for more than just finding a person or a name. Now, this was a neat little piece of research that somebody did using architecture. Notice the first date. This is Mississippi, 1850. Most farmers, this was rural architecture. Most farmers lived with that style. Dog trot, notice there are no doors on the ends of the dog trot because it's hot in Mississippi and people got breezes through there. And notice they only have 2 rooms, a parlor that's also a bedroom and a living room that's also a bedroom. They have a porch, but what's missing? There's no kitchen, there's no bathroom. Of course, those are out somewhere else. Now, you can see that one of the first things they add is a kitchen, and it's on one or the other side, this is the second one, of the back porch. The rest of it's still the same. By 1890, they've closed another part of the back porch, and these are house after house after house, and have another bedroom. Now, if you do some research in other sources, what you find out is they started taking the children into their own bedroom rather than having the children in the same bedroom with the parents. What does that say about privacy and issues of privacy? And then, by 1910, they've gotten real sophisticated. They have closed off the dog trot. They have added an L to the back. So now they can have a living room and a dining room. They can have a bigger kitchen. They can have a bedroom behind that. And I had my grandmother's brother and his wife lived in a house just like this outside of Swainsboro, Georgia. So there are all kinds of family issues that arise when you look at how people design their homes. All right. This is a population study using things like baptismal records and church records and other things, because this is colonial period, as you can see. It shows you kind of how the population of New England grows. Then the child mortality thing. In Sweden, at this same time, basically, this is late 1900s for them, late 1700s, 50% of children did not reach the age of 15. In France, 50% in that same time period did not reach 21. But look at Massachusetts. 10% of those born did not reach 21. Even earlier, only 10%. What does that say? It was healthier to be in New England than it was to be in those other countries at this time period.
But wouldn't New England not be as compact, and so you didn't have that germ factor or whatever?
That could be part of it, but you have to look. Some of this is rural as well. It's not compact. But New England was healthier. It's very interesting. And then they start looking at how often so what this says is the population is growing and people are living longer. They're living to adulthood, which means what's a New England farmer going to do? He's got to divide his land between more and more sons. Or they have to do what? They have to move further west. And so it gives, and look, this is a good example. They took one family, George Abbott, only Abbott in 1650. 100 years later, there are 25 adult male Abbotts. So it tells you something about how the population increased. And then finally, I want us to look just for a few minutes at Paul Revere. So Paul Revere married Sarah Orne, and she died in 1773. They were married in 1757. In that period, they had all these children in that first line. And if you look, and I'm sorry that it's hard to see all of this, but you can see that some of these children did not live very long. For example, Mary there. Mary was born in March of 1764. She died in April of 1765. Sarah
was, Sarah lived longer. She lived to 1778, but she was still a teenager when she died. And so you get an idea of how difficult life could be. Hannah, born in 1772, died in 1773. So Sarah dies, Hannah died 4 months after her mother died. It's most likely that Sarah died in childbirth with that last child. So Paul marries again. Sarah dies in May of 1773. He marries October of 1773. People did not stay single long, especially if you had a bunch of children that you had to raise. And he married Rachel Walker, and Rachel Walker would have some more children for Paul Revere. And it's kind of interesting if you look at some of the names, and again, children are dying. John's born on June 13th of 1776. He dies June 27th of 1776. But some of the names, Joseph Warren, he was a fellow revolutionary leader. And so you see these names. But the other thing that people sometimes notice, for example, is after the first Mary died, they had another child that they named Mary. They often did that. They used, if that was a name they wanted, or it's a family name, they would use the same name again. And here's Paul Revere. This is Paul Revere. What you may not be able to tell what he has here, he has a silver teeth because he was a silversmith. So this is Paul Revere, the artisan, kind of advertising himself. And he's young. This is when he's still fairly young. And this is the poem he wrote when he was courting Rachel Walker. Take 3/4 of a pain that makes traitors confess, rack, with 3 parts of a place which the wicked don't bless, hell, and what bad men do when they good actions refuse, air. These 4 added together with great care and art will point out thee direct to the fair one that is nearest my heart, Rachel Walker. Now, did you ever know that Paul Revere had a romantic side? It makes him more of a person, doesn't it? And there's Rachel in her older age. Here is an artifact. I wanted to include some artifacts. This is a cradle, of course, but it's made from a molasses keg. So that tells us something about how people used things. This is a letter written to Rachel. Notice how it's addressed. Mrs. Revere, Boston. I actually had a letter that was written to my grandmother in the early 20th century, well, 1920s, to Mrs. Paul Sharam, Washington.
Is it DC or?
Washington, D.C. I think it said Washington City, which is what they call D.C. This is the Revere farm, drawn by a member of the family, and you get a sense of his house. And this is, you know, a little bit later in life, so he's done fairly well with the silver business. And this is Paul, when he's a little older. And do you notice anything different besides his hair is gray and everything? Look how he's dressed in this one. He's dressed like an artisan in the first one. He's made it by his old age, and so he's dressed like a gentleman. So I just thought it would be fun to look at some of the ways we can use history and some of the questions it can bring to mind, how we think about things. What kind of questions can we ask of these sources from the past, and what can they tell us, which helps explain to us how things got to be the way they are today. So I'll leave you with a quote from Ed Cashin that you may have heard before, because I use it fairly often. I found it when I was going through Ed's papers. It was written on a scratch of paper, just a little scrap. And it said, history shapes us to begin with, and it will judge us in the end.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much.